ברוכות הבאות, ladies. ברוכות הנמצאות. Thank you so much for coming out here tonight to this incredible Chanukah shir. And I want to thank the host who's hosting this live shiur, Naomi Bat Rina. Kadosh Baruch Hu should bless her with tremendous bracha ve'atzlacha b'chol ma'aseh yadeha, shlom bayit with her husband. She should have tremendous nachat ruach from all her children, especially Yosef and Akiva, who helped to set up this entire table. Which one are you? Are you Yosef or are you Akiva? Yosef? I am so proud of you. How old are you now?
7.
7? When did you become 7? Sukkot, you were 7? Well, I give you a bracha that you should grow up to be a big tzaddik.
Amen.
And yareh shamayim.
Amen.
At the end of the day, that's what counts more than anything else.
Yeah.
And of course, as we know, this shir was originally supposed to be hosted by Olga, by Sarah, but she was not able to host it at that time. So Baruch Hashem, I think Zahava made sure she did whatever she could do to make this happen. So I want to give a bracha to Sarah Bat Nelia Nekadam. Be'ezrat Hashem HaKadosh Baruch Hu should keep you safe and healthy, protected. Should have all the yeshuot, bracha ve'atzlacha. And of course, this shiur is dedicated Le'ilui Nishmat your father, Slavic Shlomo.
Solomon.
Oh, Salomon. It's not Shlomo, because I thought for sure. Okay. Slavic Salomon ben Dora alav hashalom, and to the success and the health of your entire family.
Amen.
Sunday night, we light the first candle of the illuminating Chag of Chanukah. And after we light the menorah, we recite Perek Lamed, the 30th chapter of Sefer Tehillim. So let's analyze this Perek to draw inspiration and learn something profound so that we could actually apply the lessons to our daily life. And by the way, I forgot to mention that, of course, you know, the shiur is taped, recorded for Torah Anytime and for ohelsarah.com. So anyone who is logging on, my usual speech is that I'm always so happy and I feel so privileged and honored to know that they follow our shiurim, that the ladies log on, and they're so devoted to their own neshamot. So kudos to the ladies out there in Torah land and in Ohel Sarah land that are always logging on. Let's dive right into it. Okay. Mizmor Shir Chanukat Habayit LeDavid. A psalm, a song of dedication of the house of David. Rashi HaKadosh Alav HaShalom tells us that this particular perek is referring to the Chanukat Habayit, the time of the inaugurational ceremony of the first Bet HaMikdash. Sadly, David HaMelech Alav HaShalom was not present at the ceremony because he had already passed away, and he was not given permission by HaKadosh Baruch Hu to build the Bet HaMikdash. Why? There are many reasons that are given, but one of the reasons is that Chachamim tell us if David would have been the one to build the Bet HaMikdash, that temple would never have been destroyed. And that situation would not have been beneficial to Am Yisrael. Why? Because if we would sin in a terrible way against Hashem, then Hashem could take out his anger on the sticks and on the stones. He could destroy the Bet HaMikdash and spare the people. But if the Bet HaMikdash would remain standing forever, HaKadosh Baruch Hu would then have to destroy the people instead of the Bet HaMikdash. So instead of David building the Bet HaMikdash, HaKadosh Baruch Hu granted permission to his son Shlomo alav hashalom to build it. However, Chachamim tell us that since David yearned so much to build the house of Hashem, Hashem considered it as if he himself built it. Hence the words, Mizmor Shir Chanukat Habayit LeDavid. David received the honor because of the deep longing and desire that he had to build HaKadosh Baruch Hu's Bet Mikdash. So it's Mizmor Shir Chanukat Habayit LeDavid. Now sadly, David had many antagonists who didn't want him to build the Bet HaMikdash because they felt that his sin with Bathsheba was so grave that he didn't deserve to build it. But that changed on the day of the inauguration of the Bet HaMikdash. What happened? Interestingly, the doors of the Hechal remained sealed, almost as if somebody from above sealed them shut. And no matter what they did, and how much they prayed, or what incantations Shlomo HaMelech recited, nothing works. Nothing worked. When did the doors finally open up by themselves? When Shlomo HaMelech said the words, Ba'avur David avdecha, al tashev penei meshichecha. For the sake of your servant David, do not turn away your face of your anointed. Meaning, once Shlomo HaMelech mentioned his father's name, the doors to the Hechal opened up. So at that point, all of David's enemies were astounded and were told that their faces turned black because they realized that the Bet HaMikdash was being inaugurated in the zchut of David HaMelech. All the years they claimed, that something was wrong with David and that his actions with Bathsheba didn't afford him the zchut of building the Bet HaMikdash. But now they realized that they made a big mistake. The only reason the Bet HaMikdash was Bechlal completed was in the zchut of David HaMelech. And that's why when we look at the next pasuk, what does it say? Aromimcha Hashem, I will exalt you, God. Ki dilitani, for you raised me up. Velo simachta oivai li, and you did not allow my enemies to rejoice over me. Dilitani sounds like the word delit, which means a door. So David HaMelech was saying, there's going to come a time, Hashem, where you're going to raise me up, and you're not going to allow my enemies to rejoice over me. Ki dilitani, because the doors of the Hechal are going to open up in my zechut. Velo simachta oivai li. David was praising God for allowing the doors of the Hechal to open up in his zchut so that all his enemies should see that he was really a righteous man. But do you know what's strange about this perek of Tehillim that we're discussing? Other than these two psukim that I just read to you now, there's nothing else in this entire perek that discusses the Bet HaMikdash or the Chanukat HaBayit. The rest of this perek talks about David's troubles, his ailments, his struggles. I read to you, he says, Adonai Elohai shivati elecha, my God, I cried out to you, vatir pa'eni, and you healed me. What's going on? It seems like we just went in the opposite direction. A moment ago, we were in Yerushalayim, at the Chanukat HaBayit of the Bet HaMikdash, at the inauguration. We were at the most beautiful part of Jewish history. The first Bet HaMikdash is being inaugurated. And now all of a sudden we're in the hospital, so to speak. Vatir pa'eni. We're in a dark place. Shivati elecha vatir pa'eni. God, I called out to you and you healed me. He says more. Adonai ha'elita min she'ol nafshi. Hashem, you brought my soul up from the grave. Chayitani miyor devor. You revived me from my descent into the pit. It's possible that after the sin with Bathsheba, David thought that he's going to face punishment in Gehenna. He says the Sheol is Gehenna. But he says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu saved him from falling into the pit of Gehenna. Chayitani, HaKadosh Baruch Hu offered him life instead. Therefore he says, Zameru la'Adonai chasidav vehodu lezecher kodesho. David says we have to sing to God. The pious ones have to sing to God and give thanks to His holy name. Ki rega be'apo. For His wrath lasts but a moment. The yisurim, the afflictions that a righteous person experiences, is temporary. It's rega be'apo. Hashem's wrath lasts but a moment. Chaim birtzono. God ultimately wants life for His servants. And how do we see that? It continues. Ba'erev yalin bechi. In the evening, weeping may tarry. We cry. V'laboker rina. But in the morning there is joyful singing. Which means there are times we go to sleep crying about our yisurim, about our nisyonot, about our afflictions. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu grants us the gift of being able to wake up in the morning with a feeling of joy. Is that a beautiful thought? Yes or no?
Yeah.
A very beautiful thought, but I'm still confused. We began the Perek of Tehillim with the Chanukah Tabayit of the Bet HaMikdash, and now we're discussing somebody who's sick, struggling, filled with nisyonot, thought he's going to end up in Gehenna. But then he realizes that HaKadosh Baruch Hu took him out of Gehenna and healed him because God's wrath only lasts but a moment. And David HaMelech continues. Va'ani amarti v'shalvi bal emot le'olam. He says, and I said in my tranquility, when everything was peaceful in my life, I will never make a mistake. David says, when things were going well for me and life seemed very quiet, I thought I'm never going to make a mistake, that I would never falter from the path and that I'd remain on top. He says, but that's not the case. It seems that there were certain things that were out of my control because God is the one who runs the world. Adonai birtzoncha. God, with your will, when you felt it was necessary, he'emadet ala hareri oz. When you wanted to, you set up my mountain to be strong. You gave me strength. But there were times that you decided that you have to remain hidden from me. Histarta fanecha. You remained hidden from me. And when that happened, haiti nivhal. I became frightened and I was confused. And what did I do when I was afraid and I was confused? Elecha Adonai ekra ve'el Adonai et hanan. To you I called out, and to you, God, I would beseech, and I would ask you. Ma betza bedami. Hashem, what gain is there in my blood? Beriditi al shachat. What good would it be if I descend to the grave and if I die, if you kill me? What benefit will you have if I'm no longer around? Hayodecha afar? Can the dust thank you? When I'm in that dust, will I be able to praise you from the grave if I'm dead? Hayagid amitecha? Will the dust be able to recite your truth? Will I be able to speak your truth from the grave? Shema Adonai v'chaneni. Hear me, God, and be gracious to me. Adonai, heye ozer li. God, please be my helper. Hafachta mispedi lemachol li. You turned my lament, you turned my mourning into dancing for me. Pitachta saki. You loosened my sackcloth. Vateazreni simcha. And you fortified me with happiness. And you did it for what reason? Leman yizamercha chavod velo yidom. So that my soul could sing praises to you and not be silent. Adonai Elohai le'olam odeka. You are my God, and I will thank you forever and be eternally grateful. Ma'oz tzu Yeshuati lecha na'eh leshabeach. And then we begin to sing near the menorah. What's going on over here? We need to make sense of this. Does it make sense to you? This is what we say next to the Chanukah, Chanukiah. באמת. So in order to understand, we need to learn the significance of Chanukah itself and why the Rabbanim B'chlal named this Chag Chanukah. And the question is that the most fitting name for this Chag? Why didn't they call it Chag HaMenorah? That would have been more suitable, since the mitzvah of Chanukah is the lighting of the menorah. Why the name Chanukah? After all, Chanukah refers to what we said earlier, Chanukat HaMizbeach. And we all know that during the times of the second Beit HaMikdash, which is when this story took place, the Greeks came into our Beit Mikdash, they came into the temple, and they put their avodah zarah on the Mizbeach, and they defiled the altar. And when the Hashmonaim defeated the Greeks, and they went back into the Beit HaMikdash, they rededicated the Mizbeach. That's what we say on Chanukah. Ufinu et hechalecha. The Maccabim cleaned out the Echal from all the Avodah Zarah, from all the Tumah that was there, from all the idolatry. V'tiharu et mikdashecha. And they purified God's house. And part of purifying the Echal was that they had to rebuild the Mizbeach. And that's what we say in the Ma'oz tzu. Chanukat HaMizbeach. There was a rededication of the Mizbeach. So, you know what? So, we understand why the Rabbanim chose the name Chanukah for this Chag. But that's not what we're celebrating, is it? Are we celebrating the Chanukat HaMizbeach? Is that what the rabbis tell us we're celebrating? Yes or no?
Miracle.
No. We're celebrating the lighting of the menorah. That's what we were taught since we were kids. We were taught that the Maccabim found that one flask of oil, that one pach shemen, and it was only enough to light the menorah for one day. And from that one pach shemen, they were able to light the menorah for 8 consecutive days. That was a miracle. That was a nes. So maybe Chanukah should have been named Chag HaMenorah, the holiday of the menorah. If the Rabbanim wanted to tell us that the Maccabim rebuilt the Mizbeach and there was a Chanukat HaMizbeach, no problem, no problem. But I still want to know why they named this holiday Chanukah. After the Chanukat HaMizbeach, after the inauguration, after the altar, when the nes was really the menorah. That's the question.
Multifaceted.
That's the question. So the Slonim Rebbe Alav Shalom offers us a beautiful answer. He reminds us of the Gemara in Shabbat concerning Chanukah that states the following. My Chanukah. What is Chanukah? And the Gemara answers, what is Chanukah? Chanukah is that starting from the 25th day of Kislev, we celebrate for 8 days. Why? Because the Yevanim entered the Hechal, defiled all the pure oils that we had left. But when the kingdom of the house of the Hashmona'i family rose up against the Greeks and defeated them in battle, they returned to the Beit HaMikdash, ubatku. They searched the entire Beit HaMikdash and they couldn't find but one pach shemen, one flask of oil, shehaya munach bechotmo shel Cohen Gadol, that the flask was miraculously still closed with the special seal of the Cohen Gadol. That one pach shemen, says the Gemara, was enough to light the menorah for one day. But na'asa bo nes, a miracle happened. Vehidliku mimeno shmona yamim. From that one small flask of oil, they were able to light the menorah for 8 days. Now listen to the Gemara's language. Leshana acheret, the following year, kavum ve'asarum yamim tovim. They established these 8 days as yamim tovim, as celebratory days, holidays. That's interesting. It took the Rabbanim a year to decide whether they're going to establish Chanukah or not. Why didn't they do it the first year? Why didn't they say, Rabotai, a miracle happened over here, and we should therefore mark this day on our calendars, beginning from the 25th day of Kislev, we're going to be celebrating because Nes Gadol Haya Po. A great miracle occurred here. Everybody should know that this is going to be a holiday called Chanukah, and we're going to be celebrating it ledoreh dorot, for generations to come. That's not what the Gemara tells us. Instead, we're told, Leshana acheret. They waited an entire year, and then they established the Chag as an official holiday. Asks the Slonim Rebbe, what happened over here? And he also points out that the Gemara doesn't mention even one word about the Mizbeach that we mentioned earlier. The Gemara asks, Mai Chanukah? What is Chanukah? But it doesn't tell us, oh, Chanukah is about the Chanukat HaMizbeach. No, we're told it's about the Greeks that entered the Bet HaMikdash and defiled it. The Gemara talks about the victory of the Hashmonaim over the Greeks. We're told about the Pach Shemen that was found and that was supposed to last for one day, and instead it lasted for 8 days. But it doesn't mention anything about the Chanukat HaMizbeach and how the Hashmonaim rebuilt the Mizbeach and rededicated it. That's very strange. The Chag is called Chanukah, but what does the Gemara talk about? The Pach Shemen. My Chanukah? What's Chanukah? Pach Shemen. Pach Shemen. 1 second here. The Gemara is asking, what's Chanukah? And what's the answer? What's the answer? Oh, what's Chanukah? Oh, that's the holiday of the Pach Shemen that was found that lasted for 8 days instead of 1. What's that about? I mean, that's like asking, my menorah. What's the menorah? And you say, oh, the menorah, asu Chanukat HaMizbeach. They inaugurated the Mizbeach. Does that make sense? What does the menorah have to do with the Mizbeach? The Mizbeach have to do with the menorah? You hear the question? And the Slonim Rebbe explains the following. There's a yesod, a fundamental concept that the Ari Kadosh, alav shalom, discusses, and I'm now talking to you very esoterical teachings. The Ari Kadosh discusses a concept called Kistada d'chiyuta. What does that mean? He explains that when a person passes on from this world, the neshama ascends either to the upper realms or descends to the Sheol, the Gehenna. And whether that neshama is in Shamayim or going through the process of Gehenna, that neshama hopes that there will one day be a Tchiyat HaMetim, a resurrection of the dead. And the Ari explains that Tchiyat HaMetim cannot occur on a body that's buried in the ground, that's completely dead. Cannot happen. That body has to have a little spark of energy, some nitzotz, a spark of life in it, and it's from that spark that it can then come back to life. It could be resurrected. It's like a battery in the car that dies. As long as there's still some life left in the battery, you could always use the electric cables to reignite the battery. But you could also have a battery that's completely dead, and all the cables in the world won't help to start it. So the Ari HaKadosh, it's a very deep teaching because of the next thing I'm going to tell you, but listen very carefully. The Arizal teaches us that that little bit of energy, that little spark of life that's left in the body of the dead person, even after the neshama left the body, is called Kistada, a little bit of life. And when Mashiach comes, he's like going to be the cables. It says, he says he's going to attach himself, kiviyachol, spiritually, to that spark of life that's left in all those bodies. And that's how Tchiyat HaMetim is going to occur. So the Slonim Rebbe explains that every single Jew, no matter how far he swayed from the truth, no matter how far he drifted away from Torah and from his own neshama, he's never completely lost. There's no such thing as a completely lost Jew. No matter how far you are from Yahadut, you should never despair because you're Jewish. And that means you could always find your way back. We never write off any Jew, no matter how far he is veered off from the truth. We don't judge or decide that somebody's a lost case. We don't make decisions concerning a person based on his past or based on his present actions. So the Arizal informs us that every Jew has a spark inside of him that can never be extinguished. And our job as fellow Jews is to help kindle that spark that exists inside of him. That spark that he calls Kistada, meaning even if that little flame, that little spark of energy still exists within you, it can always be reignited. You're a Jew, and that means you have embedded within you a Kistada, a small spark of spiritual energy that could be used to trigger your neshama back into place. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu could do it through sending messengers, shlichim, that will inspire you with words. Or you might all of a sudden find yourself in a situation where you're compelled to do tshuva. Where does this turnaround come from? Where does the turnaround come from? The Arizal says it comes from Kistada, from that one spark of spiritual energy that's still left inside of you. And you should know that everybody, even the most religious and devout people, they go through ups and downs in their life. Life is one big roller coaster. You maskim?
100%.
There are times you're on a very bumpy ride, and you don't know when HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to take you off this confusing, dizzying, and difficult ride. Some of us, we just want peace and quiet. Get me off the ride. I just want peace and quiet. I don't want this balagan. We don't want to be on any roller coaster ride. We don't want ups and downs. We want continual, what we call stability, with as little turbulence as possible. Chachamim say that's not the life of the Jew, certainly not in the Galut. Chachamim tell us that we learned this from our ancestors, who were tzaddikim, who barely had a moment of rest, nor were they free from any nisyonot. Look at David HaMelech. David HaMelech's entire life, from the day he was born, was one big roller coaster ride. And because of the ups and the downs in life, there are going to be moments where we succumb to the nisyonot of life and will fail. And there will be times we will fail miserably. And when we recognize our failure, the one thing that pushes us to do teshuvah and realign ourselves with who we really are and to reconnect with Hashem's truth is that spark of spiritual energy. A Jew can always correct his failures. David HaMelech says, Ki nafalti, kamti. I may have fallen, but I could always get back up again and I could correct the mistakes that I made, no matter how grave they were. So Chachamim tell us that no matter how many times we may have engaged in the same avera again and again for years, we have to know that HaKadosh Baruch Hu's rachamim, His mercy, is limitless. Not like a human being. Our rachamim and our patience is very restricted. If you step on your friend's toes enough times at a wedding, and the same friend, I'm not talking about different people, you step on the same person's toes a few times, he might respond to you not with rachamim. You understand what I'm telling you? Yeah. Hashem's mercy, however, is limitless. No matter how many times we sin against Hashem, no matter how many times we test Him, anger Him, rebel against Him, refuse Him, reject Him, His love and His mercy towards us is immeasurable. As long as our tshuva is genuine and sincere, His mercy is always available to us. And as Jews, we need to imitate the ways of Hashem. We need to imitate the ways of Hashem. But the point is that each of us has a way back to Hashem. So you know what happened over here? You know what happened over here? Something amazing took place during the story of Chanukah. Let's put the menorah on the side for a moment, because the lighting of the menorah is an action that we took in order to emphasize the main part of the story. The question is, what's the main part of the story? What's the real story? I'm going to tell you. Am Yisrael was falling drastically in their ruchaniyut. They began adapting the Greek culture and they became Hellenists. There was a lot of intermarriage. The assimilation rate at that time was 99%. You know what that means? That means the majority of the people swayed from the path of Yahadut, and either they intermarried or they adapted the Greek culture. And the Ramban alav hashalom reveals to us that other than the Hashmona'i family and the few families that joined them, everybody else was far gone. I'm talking to you about a handful of families. And if it hadn't been, says the Ramban, for the bravery of the Maccabim who battled against the Greeks, he writes it would have been all over for the Jewish people. All over. Because most of the Jews joined the Yavanim, they became Mityavnim. And that's exactly what the Greeks intended to do. They didn't want to annihilate us physically. The Greeks had nothing against the fact that we were Jewish. They just didn't want us to be practicing Torah Jews. And sadly, the Jews fell into this trap. And the Greek attitude was something that was very appealing to them. Oh, you mean to tell us we could keep our Jewish names? We could even say that we're Jewish out loud, and all we have to do is renounce the Torah itself? In other words, be a practicing Greek with a Jewish background. Oh, that seems plausible. That seems plausible. And unfortunately, the majority of the Jews who surrounded themselves with their Greek neighbors, which is why it's so important to live in a neighborhood that you're not surrounded by Goyim, eventually fell into the trap of this dark galut, and they lost their identity. So do you know what the Torah teaches us about this? A huge chidush. It's called Kistada. When the Hashmonaim found that one pach shemen, that one flask of oil, represented the concept of Kistada chiyuta. That little pach shemen was a spiritual message that God sent to Am Yisrael, inspiring them to still hope, to tell them that there's still a glimmer of a light, a spark of spiritual energy still left inside of them that remains pure. There's a certain part of the neshama of Am Yisrael that still has not yet been tainted. That one pach shemen that was closed with the seal of the Cohen Gadol was the only flask of pure oil left in the world. It was a small flask of oil. But from this Kistada chiyuta, from this small amount of light, you could rebuild the entire nation and bring light to the darkest place in the world. The entire nation can have a tchiyat hametim from this one pach shemen. You hear what I'm telling you? And sure enough, when the Hashmonaim saw this one flask of oil, they realized this was a godly message filled with hope. This little pach shemen was calling out to them and saying, Am Yisrael is not completely foregone, nor have they been completely forsaken. You could rebuild from this little pach shemen. So the Hashmonaim took this one flask of oil and they lit the menorah. What happened? A nes. A nes. Now I ask you, ladies, was it only the nes of the oil that lasted for 8 days instead of 1? No. Once they lit the menorah with that one pach shemen, that little energy was filled with so much light, you know what happened? The darkness of the Galut of Yavan disappeared into the night and we won the war. The Bet HaMikdash was rededicated, the Mizbeach was rebuilt, and Am Yisrael found its way back to the truth. And where did this all start from? Kistada chiyuta. It began with that little spark of light that the Hashmonaim managed to recover. That small amount of light was enough to illuminate the fallen neshamot of an entire people. So ladies, that year that the miracle happened, the Rabbanim was so happy. They said, look at the koach, look at the strength that God sent us. He literally made a tchiyat hametim. The nation was almost lost forever, kimat kat, but Hashem resurrected the nation. So that first Chanukah, the Rabbanim saw the energies that Hashem dispersed into the world from that one small pach shemen, and they honestly thought that this was a one-time event in history where Hashem made such a tchiyat hametim, where He resurrected a dying nation. How many times could this happen? Such a nes. How many times? So they wondered, be'emet, how many times did this happen? En somchim ala nes, we can't rely on such a miracle year after year. So they said, oh, okay, so if that's the case, this year we have to celebrate this astounding miracle that happened to us. But next year's going to be a regular year. No need to celebrate. Next year, the 25th of Kislev, is going to be a regular day on the calendar. This is the nes. Happened this year. How many times could it happen? But what happened? Leshana acheret. The following year, a few days before the 25th of Kislev, all the Rabbanim began to feel a certain energy in the air coming back into the world. And they began to feel that, what is this? What is this? This is an energy of life. This is an energy of rejuvenation in the air. L'shana acheret. The following year, after that first Chanukah, they began to feel what they felt the year before. So they said, oh, wait a second here. These energies that we felt last year, they're coming back. It's not a one-time event. And that's when they realized that HaKadosh Baruch Hu earmarked the 25th day of Kislev as a time to renew yourself, as a time to rejuvenate yourself, as a time to correct your mistakes and come closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu's truth, as a time to connect to that Kistada, to that small spark of spiritual energy that still flows through you. This is the time where you could turn to the Ribono Shel Olam and you could say, even though I was in a place where I needed healing and I was sick, isn't that what David HaMelech told Hashem? I wasn't well. I was in a spiritually unhealthy place in my life and I made terrible mistakes and I hurt you, Hashem, and I hurt others. And even though I was so depressed and I functioned in a way that I'm not used to, and although I did things that certainly did not make you happy at all with me, I know that you gave me Chanukah as a means to heal my neshama. You sent me Chanukah as a way of telling me, don't worry. Here's one small pach shemen just for you. Here's an opening of light. Go and banish the darkness that you created. Start bringing the light of truth back into your neshama from that small place of hope that I'm sending you. And that pach shemen is going to make miracles for you. You're going to see how that small light is not just going to last for one day. It's going to last for many days. And you're going to see how it's going to illuminate everything around you. That pach shemen is going to bring you back. Therefore, the Shana Acheret, the following year, after the Rabbanim realized this, they made an announcement. They said, Rabotai, remember last year we told you that this was a one-time holiday, a one-time event in history? Well, we were wrong. We made a mistake. It's not a one-time event. The energies of that time have come back. And you should feel those energies in the air calling out to you to light that small flame that still exists inside of you. Could you feel that spark burning inside? In this generation, and after this crazy pandemic, many of us shifted away from our normal routines and more. So Chanukah is the time where Hashem is giving us an immense opportunity, and He tells us, come back. Where'd you go? Come back. You still have the opportunity to correct your mistakes, to make amends, and to return to the truth. I instilled in every Jew a pach shemen that could be accessed around the 25th day of Kislev. That's when the energies and the forces of that little flask of oil is most powerful. Use the pach shemen to reignite the flame. And there's a hint to this idea in the Torah HaKadosha itself, in Parashat Naso. At the end of the parasha, what does the pasuk say? It says like this: Zot Chanukat HaMizbeach Beyom Himashach Oto. This was the dedication offering of the altar that was presented by the Nesiim on the day that it was anointed. Wait a second. It seems that over here, the Torah is also talking about some kind of Chanukat HaBayit, in the same way that David HaMelech's Perek of Tehillim talks about the Chanukat HaMizbeach. Actually, the Chanukat HaMizbeach in both. So, as Chachamim refer to it, Chanukat HaBayit, that's what they refer to it. So what is this all about? What is this all about? And the Slonim Rebbe explains that the human being is like a bayit. It's like a home. Just like in a bayit, there are different rooms, different compartments, so too with the human being. The human being is made up of different limbs, various components and parts to him. Every human being is like a bayit. And the chidush of the holiday of the menorah, which they call Chag HaOrot, the festival of lights, is that we can make a Chanukah habayit, which means you could rededicate the bayit. Who's the bayit? You. You could rededicate yourself and become new again. You could take that which you broke, or that which you broke in someone else, and you could repair. You could rebuild and inaugurate a part of yourself to Hashem. And that's what happened on that day in the Bet HaMikdash all those years ago. When the Hashmonaim lit the menorah, that flame that shone brightly, the nerot, they were just a sign of the rededication. That was just like a symbol. But the main thing was the Chanukah Bayit, the rededication of the neshama. The holiday of Chanukah teaches us that we could always resurrect ourselves, that we could take ourselves out from the place of darkness that we created and rededicate ourselves to creating light. My Chanukah, you know what Chanukah is? It's the Chanukah in you, because you're the bayit. You could lift yourself up from the darkness that you allowed yourself to be led into. You could take the little spark of hope that's left inside of you and you could reignite yourself. Therefore, the pasuk in the Torah in Parashat Naso says, Zot Chanukat HaMizbeach Beyom Himashach Oto. This is the inauguration of the Mizbeach on the day that it was anointed. Bayom. But look what happens a few psukim later, very interestingly. What does it say? Zot Chanukat HaMizbeach Acharei Himashach Oto. This was the inauguration of the Mizbeach, of the altar, after it was anointed. Make up your minds. Is it Chanukat HaMizbeach Beyom, on the day it was inaugurated, or is it Chanukat HaMizbeach Acharei, after it was anointed? You know what the answer is? It's actually what the Gemara says about Chanukah. What did we learn just a few minutes ago? The first year the miracle Chanukah occurred, they thought it was Beyom. Beyom, the Rabbanim thought the Chanukah, the message of Chanukah was only for that time period, that day, Beyom. They thought that the revival and rejuvenation of the Jewish spirit was a once-in-a-lifetime event. But L'shana Acheret, Acharei, following that year, they realized, oh, no, Zot Chanukat HaMizbeach, even Acharei Himashach Oto. Which means the feeling and the inspiration of that time period of the story of Chanukah and all the spiritual messages that come along with it, they last throughout the generations and they're felt every year during this time. Therefore, ultimately, the name that the Rabbanim chose for this Chag was indeed correct. It most definitely is Chanukah. Because how does Chanukah manifest itself? How does it manifest itself? Of course we know that, oh, we found the Pach Shemen. But finding that one flask of oil demonstrated that nobody is lost forever. That you could come back to yourself, to the truth. That you could revive your neshama when you fell and when you chose the darkness. Of course we know that the mitzvah is the lighting of the menorah. But the light of the menorah stands for something deeper and more profound. The menorah represents Sheyesh Chanukat Habayit. That every Jew can be mechanech himself, he can re-educate himself, and rededicate himself to God's truth. Every Jew can revive his spirit and repair that which he shattered. You could put together that which you dismantled. You could turn on the light in a room that you made dark. And you could revive that which you deemed lifeless. So if that's the case, we can now understand why one of the things that the Yevanim abolished was Rosh Chodesh, the celebration of the new moon. That's one of the mitzvot they didn't want us to celebrate. Why? Why this mitzvah? I mean, I could understand why they wanted to eliminate the Shabbat from us. After all, Shabbat is the time we connect to God, to His Torah. So it makes sense that they would want us to refrain from observing the Shabbat. They also took away Brit Milah. They didn't allow us to circumcise our baby boys. That mitzvah that they removed from us is also understandable, because that's a physical covenant between the Jewish males and the Ribono Shel Olam and God. But they abolished Rosh Chodesh. And if the Greeks did away with Rosh Chodesh, they must have known its power. So the question is, why Rosh Chodesh? What happens on Rosh Chodesh that it needed to be abolished? You see, the Greeks and most of the Gentile world, they used the solar calendar to determine their days. Whereas the Jewish calendar is measured according to the cycles of the moon. We use a lunar calendar. Why do we use the cycle of the moon to determine our days and our chagim? Because the moon is inconsistent. It waxes and it wanes. It isn't very stable. In the beginning of the month, you could barely see a sliver of the moon. But as the month progresses, it becomes larger and larger until it reaches its apex in the middle of the month around the 15th day. And from that point on, the moon starts to diminish again. So Am Yisrael is like the moon, in the sense that we have ups and we have downs. We have times of wholesomeness and we have times where we're diminishing. But in reality, the moon never disappears. You will always see even a sliver of the moon at the time that you might think it's completely disappearing, like where's it going? Therefore the Chachamim say, Gam hem atidim litchadesh kemota. The Jewish people, like the moon, will always renew themselves. These are the words that we recite during the Birkat HaLevana. Jews have the ability to be mitchadesh, to renew themselves and to revitalize themselves. Therefore, to us, Rosh Chodesh represents not just the beginning of a new month, but the itchadshut, the renewal of the person. Not only could we come back, but we can come back like the moon in our full glory, wholesome and complete. And the Greeks, they couldn't accept that. They told Am Yisrael, what are you talking about? There's no such thing. You're not like the moon that waxes and wanes. You have no connection not to the moon, ups and downs. Once you go down, you're finished. You can never come out of that darkness. So you may as well be completely secularized and come to our machaneh. Be like us. So they abolished Rosh Chodesh in order to break our spirit. In order to do away with the message of Rosh Chodesh, which is that we could still renew and revive ourselves. Therefore, the miracle of Chanukah took place specifically with the Pach Shemen, with that little bit of oil, which we call that sliver of light. Because that was Hashem's way of telling us, don't believe anybody who tells you that it's over. I'm giving you this small flask of oil to remind you of the restoration of the moon. Just like the moon begins to grow from the tiniest sliver, you too can be transformed and revive yourselves. That's why the Mefarshim tell us that on every Chanukah, there has to be at least one Shabbat that falls out in the middle of Chanukah. There must be a Shabbat, because the Greeks tried to abolish the Shabbat. That's why Chanukah is made up of 8 days. It's because the Greeks tried to do away with Brit Milah, which takes place on the 8th day following the baby's birth. And every Chanukah, there must be a Rosh Chodesh embedded in it. There will always be a Rosh Chodesh Tevet towards the end of Chanukah. And that's because the Greeks tried to abolish a Rosh Chodesh. And Chachamim, by the way, tell us that the Rosh Chodesh Tevet that falls out on Chanukah, that's a huge day. It's a huge day. Why? Because the month of Tevet is ushering in with it hope. That's what the Rosh Chodesh is, no? The revival and the restored spirit of the Jew. It's the month that demonstrates to us that we're like the moon. Tevet, because it's in Hanukkah time, teaches us that even though we just experienced such darkness and it seemed hopeless, although we were shaken from our place of truth and we allowed others to misdirect us away from our proper path, although we went down in our levels of ruchaniyut because of the bad choices that we made, Rosh Chodesh Tevet marks the dawn of a new day. It marks the revival of your spirit and the hope that comes along with a new month. Incidentally, we know, by the way, I'm going to teach you now an even deeper yesod. If this was not deep enough, we'll go deeper. We know that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is mechadesh betuvo bechol yom tamid ma'aseh bereshit, which means Hashem is constantly recreating this world at every moment, every day. You know why He does that? In order to send you a message of hope, recovery, and renewal. That's His way of telling you, forget about what you did or what you just thought about a minute ago, a moment ago. What happened a moment ago was a completely different world. A moment later, I just recreated the world for you. So you're now living in a new world. Make the most of it. Chadashim labkarim. The next morning could be a brand new day of corrections, of tikkunim, of hope, and of light. This is what Jews believe. We believe that no person or circumstance in life is hopeless or without repair. There is always a pach shemen. There's always a small glimmer of light that HaKadosh Baruch Hu makes available to us that we could use to come back, to correct, and to be pure again. So in order to commemorate the Pach Shemen, we light the menorah. But the lighting of the menorah is to remind us of what? Of the Chanukah Habayit. That we could rededicate and rebuild ourselves. And there's a hint of this, a remez, in this Perek of Tehillim, Perek Lamed, that we began the shiur with. The first words of this Perek are what? Mizmor Shir Chanukat. The acronym, the Rashi Tevot of these first 3 words, Mizmor Shir Chanukat, right? What does this signify?
Mashach.
Yeah, I know it says Mashach. But that's a good one also, except it's missing the Yud. But in the Sefer Bet Avraham, Rabbi Avraham, Alav Shalom, explains that these 3 letters, they allude to the 3 mitzvot that the Greeks did away with. Mem is milah, brit milah, circumcision. Shin is the Shabbat. They tried to take that away from us. And Chet is Chodesh. Really, they say Chet is Chanukah, but on Chanukah we have a Chodesh. Rosh Chodesh is what the Greeks wanted to abolish, and their point is that Chanukah and Rosh Chodesh, they go hand in hand. Why? Because the Greeks went after the Hitchadshut. They went after the renewal and the revival of the Jewish spirit. They wanted us to believe that God abandoned us forever because we assimilated. They wanted us to believe that we could never be pure again, that we can never correct, we can never be whole like the moon. They wanted us to accept the notion that the relationship between us and Hashem was over, is dead, and is gone. That Hashem went his separate way and left the scene. And Chanukah says, Chas v'shalom. We have a new month in Chanukah. We have Chodesh Tevet. And just like Hashem renews the moon, He'll revive the Jewish people, because we have something called Chanukah Habayit, which means that we could always rededicate ourselves even when we made the most grievous mistakes. And you know what happens when you reach this exalted level of realization that you could renew and you could rebuild and you could revive yourself? It literally propels you to great heights of simcha. Think about it. I want you to think about it for a second. Think together with me. There is nothing more depressing than to think like this. That's it. It's over. There's no more hope for me. With the situation that I'm in, it's a total darkness. I'm in the darkness of the abyss. How am I going to get out of it? It's a huge, endless pit. It's choshech al panei tehom. It's dark, and it looks like it's going to remain dark for a very long time. It looks like I'm probably never going to heal from this. When a person thinks this way, he becomes meyuash. He is despairing. He becomes despondent, and that's when he's enveloped by the darkness. And any decision he's going to make in his life will come from that place of choshech al panei tehom, is going to come from that place of confusion, of despair, and of sadness. Such a person, even he's smiling to the world, and his family and everybody around him, they think he's so happy, and he pretends to be at peace, and maybe even thinks that he is at peace, is really the saddest person. Because inside of him, he's enveloped by the choshech, by a state of total darkness and hopelessness. Because in his mind, it's over. And it ain't over till the fat lady sings, as we say. But anyway, but now think the opposite. By the way, this is Rabbi Nachman's teachings. If a person knows and he feels and he thinks he could always come back, I could always repair the damage, I could fix it, I could bring light into the darkness that I created, Hashem will accept me, and more, He's going to retrieve me from the depths of my lowliness. And I know it. You know what kind of simcha he experiences? That's why this Perek Lamed of Tehillim begins with the words Mizmor Shir Chanukah Habayit. Because those four letters, Mizmor Shir Chanukah Habayit, they spell the word simcha. See this? That's when the simcha, that's where it really comes from. It's from Mizmor Shir Chanukah Habayit. It comes from the Chanukah Habayit, from the realization and the belief that you could always rebuild. You could always renew. no matter what you did, how low you sank, how awful you may have behaved contrary to the Torah and what Hashem would have wanted from you, there's a Chanukah Habayit. There's a Kistada Chayuta. There's a spark of energy left inside of you that you could use to rededicate yourself. And I want to now conclude with this thought, a very deep thought. I have a question for you. If you were choosing a month that commemorates what we're doing with the whole speech that we were talking about, renewal, rejuvenation, rebirth, rebuilding, which month would you choose? If we needed a month that symbolizes the idea we could always correct, come back to the truth, tchiyat metim, tikkunim, renewal, which would best symbolize this idea?
Tishrei.
You say Tishrei.
Elul.
That's a good one. That's a good one. Chachamim say Nisan. Chodesh Nisan. Why? Because the month of Nisan comes after a very long winter. That's the time where the trees barely have any leaves on them in the winter. There's hardly any grass. The colors that surround us are not as vivid, and the world seems lifeless. But then when Chodesh Nisan rolls around on the calendar, what happens? The sun begins to shine in ways that it didn't before. The ice starts to melt. Everything begins to grow, and the world around you is blossoming with a vibrancy and filling itself with color and with life. Beginning the month of Nisan, the world starts coming back to life again, springtime. And Nisan is where you could really see the tchiyat metim of the entire world. So maybe it would have been more fitting to celebrate Chanukah in the month of Nisan. So you say, but we already have a holiday in Nisan. It's called Pesach, right? And you're right, but technically that's where Chanukah really belongs, based on everything we're learning here tonight. And interestingly, Chachamim tell us no. Chanukah in Nisan is not where it belongs. That's not where it belongs. The real time to establish Chanukah is not the good time that's the most obvious. The month of Nisan is the most obvious month because the springtime breeds rejuvenation, and that's the most obvious. It's very clear. No. I want to see a renewal and a revival even in the dead of winter. I want to know and I want to see that even in the darkest of times, in a place where nothing is growing, where nothing seems to be moving, and there seems to be no life, at such a time I want to see the revival. In the winter, darkness descends upon us very early in the day. In the winter, we experience the longest days of darkness. And at such a time and in such a place of darkness, to tell me there's life, that's a chidush. That's the lesson of Chanukah. So the lesson of this illuminating holiday is really most suitable during the month of Kislev, smack in the middle of the winter. Because that's the time of darkness, of emptiness, of void, of choshech al penei tehom. And Chanukah teaches us to light a candle dafka when you find yourself in the darkest time. Even in times of darkness, there's a pach shemen that you could find. And there's no more suitable a time than the month of Kislev to celebrate the lesson of Chanukah. So let's wrap it up and go back to our perek of Tehillim. David HaMelech says, Mizmor Shir Chanukat Habayit LeDavid. This is the chapter of each person's individual Chanukat Habayit. That's why it says LeDavid. LeDavid means it's personal. It's LeDavid, it's LeMoshe, it's LeHana, it's LeSarah, it's LeRut, it's LeDvorah, LeRivka. Each of us has an individual Chanukat Habayit that you could experience. And David HaMelech was referring to his personal experience of life. He says, I may have fallen, I may have been a little sick, I may have been unhealthy, and I faltered from the way. I had my ups, I had my downs. But Aromimcha Hashem, I praise you Hashem, that you didn't let the Yetzer Hara conquer me. Velo simachta oivai li. You didn't allow the evil, whether the evil that was inside of me or the evil that others ruled over me, to turn me into someone that I'm not. You brought me back from the Sheol. You didn't leave me there in the darkness. Vatirpa'eni, you healed me. You offered me the cure to my ailment. Chayitani, you revived me when I was in the pit of darkness. And because of that, Zameru la Hashem Chasidav. All the Chasidim of Hashem, they have to sing to God. Why? Because we're all like David. We're all like David. We're all Chasidim of Hashem. If David HaMelech could fall and then come back up from that fall, if Hashem could accept David's tshuva, he could accept all of our tshuva. So this perek talks about the downfall, the ailment, but also the rise and the elevation of David HaMelech. Therefore David HaMelech calls out to Hashem, Elecha Hashem ekra. Because David was teaching us that even after a person sinned and made awful mistakes, if he does sincere tshuva, not only are his sins erased, his sins turn into mitzvot. What does he say? Hafachta mispedi lemachol li. You turned the mourning of my averot into a simcha of mitzvot. And then what? Vateazreni simcha. You brought me to the place of simcha. You made me realize that I could always rebuild even after I destroyed. And therefore this perek of Tehillim is very appropriate for Chanukah, because it mentions the personal struggles of David HaMelech. And David is telling us that he went through so many dark periods in his life. So many challenges, so many ups, so many downs, so much hurt, so much pain. But he made it through those dark times. And he allowed himself to see that small glimmer of light. He used the Pach Shemen in his life to return and to mend. Therefore, ladies, Chanukah should be one of the happiest times of the year for our nation. Because even at a time where we feel lifeless, without enthusiasm or spiritedness, when we'll light the menorah on the first night, that's the glimmer of hope. That's the Chanukat Habayit achrei himashach oto. That's the spiritual energy that comes back every year following that first year on the 25th day of Kislev all those years ago. And that same hope of revival is available to us and giving us the ability to rebuild. So ladies, Chanukah is such a holy and auspicious time. This is the time of second chances. You could still correct and bring light into a depressing and dark circumstance. This perek of Tehillim is a motivator. It's a perek that reminds us of the hope that still exists out there in the world and inside of us. It's that Kistada, Chayuta, that little Pach Shemen that exists, that can be reunited and illuminated. Therefore, Chanukah becomes the most hopeful Chag, because it takes place in the winter, where there's very little optimism in the air. And it teaches us that in Kislev is where the Hitchadshut lies, where the renewal and revival of the Jewish spirit could really take place. So we just learned a very profound message about this Chag. And this Perek of Tehillim that we're going to be reciting over the Chag. Yehi Ratzon, that the lessons of this shiur penetrate your heart and your soul. May it fill your being with hope, with meaning, and with optimism for the upcoming Chag and everything that you could achieve and accomplish. And Be'ezrat Hashem, with the renewal and rededication of your neshama, you'll see nisim. You're going to see miracles in your life, and you're going to be the recipients of many brachot and experience a true simcha. Amen ken. Yehi Ratzon.